that they told me not to knit anything yet. "It's too soon," Lisa said, her voice all honey and distance, like she was already preparing the border between what belonged to her and what belonged to no one. I remember standing in their kitchen, holding a skein of pale green yarn I had picked out myself, a soft, gentle color, the one she'd marked on the baby registry under preferred palette. I wasn't trying to impose. I only wanted to begin, but she reached for the yarn without touching it and said, "Let's wait until we're sure it's sticking." That was the first time I felt it. The turn, the pivot, as if all my care and anticipation were an intrusion, a shadow across their perfect, curated hope. I stepped back, apologized. I always apologized, and tucked the yarn into my tote bag. I told myself it was hormones, that I needed to be patient. But in my chest, something small had already curled inward. I'm 78. I live alone now in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of a town no one passes through unless they mean to. I used to live near them, 20 minutes away, a straight shot down Route 7. But after last spring, I asked a neighbor to help me box up 30 years of family photographs, kitchen gadgets, recipe cards, and silent rooms. I moved out in late June. No fanfare, no going-away dinner. Just me, a rented van, and a quiet realization that the life I had built as a mother and widow no longer had a door through which I could be invited. My son, Ethan, is 41. I raised him after my husband died when Ethan was 12. He was the kind of boy who memorized dinosaur names and cried when the neighbor's cat got hit by a car. He used to leave me sticky notes on the fridge that said, "Love you, Mom," with little smiley faces. He married Lisa when he was 33. She was efficient, polished, the kind of woman who ran a book club and corrected your grammar mid-sentence. I tried not to mind. She made Ethan happy, or at least gave him a life that looked impressive from the outside. They bought a modern house in a planned community with mailbox clusters and quarterly newsletters. I wasn't part of the planning. That was the beginning of things being beautiful, but not warm. 3 years into the marriage, they told me about their fertility struggles. They came over for dinner, grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, something safe and well-plated, and sat at my table like clients presenting a case. Lisa did most of the talking. There had been attempts, disappointments, tests, second opinions. I poured more wine, nodded in the right places. Then Ethan looked at me, his hands clasped like he used to do when he asked for extra screen time as a boy, and said, "We're looking into IVF. It's expensive. We have some savings, but—" I knew what he was asking before he finished. I could see it in the space between his words. I had savings too. My late husband's pension, my cautious living, the money I never spent on myself except for yarn and books from the used shop. I told them yes, that same night. Didn't even ask how much. I told myself it was love. And it was. It still is, in a way that's grown quiet and bruised. The total came to $22,000. It paid for everything. The consultations, the medications, the procedures, the freezing, the transfers. Lisa emailed me receipts like it was a business transaction, thanked me once in a carefully worded text. I wasn't bitter. Not then. I drove them to 2 of the appointments. I sat in the waiting room flipping through outdated magazines while they were in the back. They never invited me in. I understood. Boundaries. Privacy. The nurse assumed I was the driver. No one corrected her. When the pregnancy test came back positive, they didn't call. I saw the announcement on social media, an ultrasound photo with the caption, "Our little miracle, coming this fall." My name wasn't mentioned. I read the post twice, then closed the app and opened my knitting basket. I started the blanket anyway, pale green with a white border, soft as breath. The months passed like weather you try to ignore. They gave me updates when I asked. Never more. Lisa was measured, talking about her body like a project under construction. Ethan was worse, absent in a way that made me think of hollow trees, tall and beautiful, but already dead inside. I offered to help set up the nursery. Lisa said it was already handled. I asked if they wanted me at the baby shower. She said, "Oh, we're doing something small with just friends." She said it like I was a category that no longer fit. On the day of the shower, I stayed home and made lemon bars, the kind Ethan used to request on his birthday. I wrapped them carefully and left them at their doorstep, with a note that just said, "Love you both. So happy for you." They never mentioned them. When the due date came close, I asked if they wanted me nearby. I could stay at a hotel, I said, just in case they needed help. Lisa answered with a smile in her voice, but the words were made of fences. "I think we'll want space at first. You know how those first days are." I did. I remembered the blur of feedings, the cracked hands, the fatigue that curled around your spine like ivy, but I also remembered needing someone, needing my own mother, who was long gone, and how I would have given anything for a hand on my back saying, "You're doing fine." I wanted to be that hand. They wanted silence. I gave it. The baby was born on a Tuesday. I got a photo from Ethan at 3:14 p.m. It was cropped close, just the baby's face. No names, no stats. Just, "She's here." I stared at the screen for a long time before realizing they hadn't told me her name. I replied, "She's beautiful. Congratulations, I didn't ask for more." That weekend, I went to Target and bought a soft, white sweater for a newborn, stitched her name, once I finally learned it, into the corner of the blanket I'd finished, and wrapped it all in a box with tissue and ribbon. I dropped it off myself. Lisa opened the door and blinked like she wasn't expecting me. She took the box, thanked me, said the baby was sleeping. I didn't get to hold her. I told myself next time. There would be a next time. Weeks passed. Photos were posted. Her mother holding the baby, her sister, even their dog. No sign of me. I stopped asking. Then came the moment that drew the line in ink. Ethan stopped by to drop off some paperwork I had accidentally received in my mail. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight, and said the sentence so casual. It was surgical. "Lisa thinks it's best if we keep things simple for now. You know, not confuse the baby with too many faces." I looked at my son. This man I had once bathed, fed, protected from thunderstorms, and said, "I'm not a stranger." He looked away and said, "It's just not the story we're building." I felt it like a slap with no sound. Not the story. I had paid for the beginning of that story, with my money, with my care, with the hope I had dared to carry. But now I was cut from the pages, left out of the narrative like a deleted scene. That night, I sat with the blanket folded in my lap, the stitches soft and even. I ran my hands over the threads and whispered, "I still made you. Even if they won't let me love you, I still made you." No one heard me. But I did, and maybe that was the start of something. Not revenge, not even grief. Just a new chapter where I would stop waiting to be written in. The day I transferred the money, it was raining. I remember that because I left the bank with damp shoes and a receipt that felt heavier than any paper ought to. $22,000 moved from my account to theirs in under 45 seconds. The teller didn't even look up. She just said, "There you go," and slid the confirmation toward me like it was a coffee order. I folded it in half, then in half again, until it was the size of a thumbnail, and tucked it into the coin pocket of my purse. I told myself it didn't matter what it looked like, big or small, folded or flat. The number meant the same thing. It meant they had a chance. It meant I had done the right thing. It meant, maybe, I would belong. That night, I made a pot of soup and left half of it untouched. I sat on the edge of the bed with a knitting needle in my hand and stared at the empty spot on the dresser, where I imagined a photo of the baby would go one day. I didn't knit that evening. My hands were still too full of silence. When I was a child, money was a loud thing. It shouted in our house, banged its fists on the table, and reminded us daily that we didn't have enough. My father kept coins in a tobacco tin labeled "emergencies only." My mother taught me to turn collars and darn socks, until the fabric itself gave up. So when I married Derek, who wasn't rich but dependable, I learned how to save with almost religious fervor. Every Christmas bonus, every tax return, every unexpected refund was tucked away into envelopes I labeled with dates and small dreams. Roof repairs, emergency travel, maybe Paris. I never got to Paris. Life intervened, as it always does. Derek died early. Ethan needed braces, and then college, and then the apartment deposit for his first place. I gave, quietly, each time. I didn't keep score. I kept love. At least, I thought I did. So when Ethan asked about IVF, I didn't hesitate, not for a second. He said it was their last resort, that they had tried everything short of mortgaging the house. Lisa had a tone in her voice when she described the process, one I didn't recognize. Clinical, detached, but threaded with tension, like someone trying not to bleed in public. She said, "We're emotionally invested, but we're trying not to get our hopes up." I wanted to say something reassuring, something maternal, something that would warm the space between us. But Lisa didn't want warmth. She wanted precision. So I said, "How much do you need?" And she named the number like it was nothing personal, just math. I wired the money that Friday. They confirmed the receipt that evening with a short message. "Got it. Thank you again. Fingers crossed." That was all. I waited for more, but nothing came. I assumed I'd be included, not in everything, not in the appointments or the intimate rituals of hope, but in the general story. A phone call here, an update there. Instead, I became a sort of shadow investor, invisible unless needed. I learned about most milestones through photos. Embryo count, transfer day, beta results. I'll post it online for their friends, wrapped in tasteful filters and hashtags. I double-tapped like any proud parent. I left short comments. So happy for you both. Wishing you all the love in the world, but never got replies. I figured they were overwhelmed. That's what people said when they didn't want to call. It's just been a lot. So I gave space. I waited. I bought a tiny pair of hand-knit booties from a woman at the farmer's market, who reminded me of my own mother. She had soft hands and told me, "That shade of cream looks beautiful on new babies." I thanked her and put the booties in my hope drawer, next to a bib that said, "Loved beyond measure." One afternoon in early March, Ethan stopped by. I was baking zucchini bread. The house smelled like nutmeg and second chances. He didn't stay long, just stood by the door while I handed him a container and asked how Lisa was doing. "She's fine," he said, "just tired." Then he added, "We're trying to keep everything calm and low stress, you know." I nodded. "Of course, that's important." But then he looked away and said, "Lisa thinks it's better if we don't get too many people involved yet, just until the second trimester is over." I asked, gently, if that included me. He paused. "Not like that," he said. "It's just, we want this to be ours for now. Intimate." I nodded again. What else was there to do? I smiled, told him I understood. That night, I pulled the booties out of the drawer and placed them in a box, wrapped them in soft tissue paper, then closed the lid. I didn't unwrap them again for months. The day they found out the baby's gender, they had a little gathering with pastel balloons and cupcakes filled with colored cream. I wasn't invited. I saw the video on a mutual friend's Instagram story. Lisa stood in the middle of their yard in a fitted pink dress, while Ethan popped a confetti cannon. Pink. A girl. Everyone cheered. Lisa's mother cried and hugged her. Ethan lifted her gently off the ground, spinning her in a circle. I watched that video 5 times, then turned off my phone. I didn't cry. I just stared at the wall for a while and tried to understand how I had been edited out of something I helped create. I kept seeing that moment. The cannon bursting, the pink rain falling, the arms that wrapped around each other without space for one more. It wasn't cruelty. That's what I kept telling myself. It wasn't cruelty. It was erasure by design. A week later, I received a message from Lisa. It was polite, sterile, like correspondence from a HR department. She thanked me again for my generosity and said they had everything they needed now, that they were in a good place and focusing on the next chapter. Then came the line that scraped like sandpaper. "We hope you understand our need to define this journey in a way that feels right for us." Define, as if I were a variable in an equation they no longer needed to solve. I replied, "Of course, wishing you all the peace and joy this season brings." I signed it with love, but it didn't feel like love. It felt like paperwork. That spring I sat on my porch and watched the wind move through the trees. The baby was due in June. I knew that much. I started knitting again, not because they asked, or because I thought they would want what I made, but because my hands needed to do something. Each row was a memory, each stitch a word I hadn't been allowed to say. I'm here. I care. Don't forget me. I used the pale green yarn, the same one I'd tucked away after Lisa told me not to start too early. I knitted in the mornings with the news on low and the windows open. I knitted in the afternoons while reheating leftovers and letting them cool untouched. I knitted in the evenings with a lamp behind my shoulder, and no one to say good night to. The blanket grew slowly, quietly, deliberately, like love, like grief, like something that had to be finished, even if it would never be used. Then came the message from Ethan, short, clipped, and final. We appreciate everything, but Lisa feels it's best if we keep this next phase private. Thank you for understanding. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. They were building a family, and I had been recast as a donor, a bystander, a non-essential character, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of that cold efficiency that turns people into categories. I was the help, the financial enabler, the woman in the corner with the yarn and too many hopes. I sat on the floor of my living room with the finished blanket in my lap and stared at the edge, where I had stitched a single word in thread, only slightly lighter than the rest. Welcome. That was all. No name. No date. Just that one word I had not been granted the right to say aloud. And yet I whispered it anyway. Not to Lisa. Not to Ethan. Not even to the baby. To myself. Welcome to the truth. Welcome to the letting go. I folded the blanket carefully, placed it in a clean box, and sealed the lid. I carried it to the post office the next morning and sent it without a return address. I don't know what they did with it. Maybe they threw it away. Maybe they donated it. Maybe it sits in a drawer, too soft and too real for the curated life they've constructed. I don't care. It was never about being seen. It was about seeing clearly. And now I did. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house, when the people you love begin to regard you as an inconvenience. It's not loud, not dramatic. It's in the pauses between messages that never arrive, the softened tone of a voice that once called you Mom, with warmth, but now sounds like a customer service representative managing a difficult client. It's in the way your own phone lights up less and less, not because you've missed a call, but because no one is calling. That silence arrived in my life slowly, so gradually. I almost didn't notice at first. I kept telling myself they were busy, adjusting to life with a newborn, wrapped up in that haze of feedings and laundry and long nights. I knew what that was like. I'd been through it. I knew how hard it was, so I excused the lack of updates, the unanswered texts, the absence of photos. I told myself it was temporary, that I wasn't being left out, just delayed. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true. I sent them meals the first week, not homemade. Lisa had strong feelings about gluten and dairy and digestive peace, but pre-prepared organic deliveries from a local service she once mentioned liking. I didn't get a thank you. Not even a thumbs-up emoji. I sent a note through the app that let me know it had been delivered. Still, nothing. The next week, I mailed a card. Inside was a simple message in my careful cursive. Thinking of you three. And sending love. No reply, not even from Ethan, who used to send me smiley faces for no reason when he was in college. My son had always been quiet, yes, but never unkind. Now he was something else, cordial, distant, like a man who owed someone money and was trying not to think about it. Only the debt wasn't financial. That had been paid in full. The real debt was emotional, and no one was collecting. One morning, I walked past the nursery aisle at the pharmacy and felt my chest tighten. The shelves were lined with pastel bottles and soft bristled brushes, wipes in calming lavender scent, tiny cotton mittens, and tubs of diaper cream. I reached out without thinking and touched a small muslin swaddle printed with watercolor stars. It was the kind of thing I would have bought once. Maybe I even had. But now I hesitated. Who was I buying it for? Not for them. Not anymore. They didn't want that. They had everything they needed. Or so they said. I stood there for several minutes, long enough for the clerk to ask twice if I needed help. I shook my head, stepped away, and left the store with nothing in my hands. I began filling my time with quieter things, rearranging drawers, polishing picture frames, organizing old receipts into folders. It gave my days structure, even if the purpose was faint. I vacuumed already clean rugs and watered already damp plants. I wrote grocery lists in cursive, just to feel the motion of my hand moving with intention. I did not check social media as often. When I did, I regretted it. Photos of Lisa's mother, holding the baby. Lisa's sister posting, "Auntie Life is the best life." A carousel of images captioned, "3 generations of women, all 3 smiling on a picnic blanket under a tree, all 3 with matching hairbands." I zoomed in. The baby was wearing a pale yellow onesie. Not the blanket. Not the booties. Not the sweater I had dropped off weeks earlier. Nothing I had made or touched. I did not exist in those photos. I did not exist in that story. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Not rage. No, that would have had direction, heat, clarity. This was softer, more disorienting, like fog behind the eyes, like you've walked into a room you don't recognize in your own house. Dislocation. Unmooring. I stopped knitting. The yarn sat untouched for days. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. It felt performative now, like I was pretending to be someone who still had a place to send things. Instead, I sat by the window with a cup of tea that always went cold. I listened to the neighbors' children play outside. Their laughter irritated me, not because it was loud, but because it was real. I wanted to be better than that. I wasn't. A week later, I saw a post from someone in the community group, an appeal for donations to the women's shelter downtown. They needed baby items, especially handmade things. I took out the untouched yarn, the skeins of soft green and cream, and began to knit again. Not for a grandchild who wouldn't know my name, but for a child who might at least wear what I made. The motion was slow at first. My fingers had stiffened, but it came back, like muscle memory, like grace. I finished a blanket in 3 days, then a second. I dropped them off at the shelter without leaving my name. The woman at the front desk looked surprised. "Did you make these?" she asked. I nodded. "Well," she said, "they're going to love them. You can't buy love like this in a store." I felt a catch in my throat and left before I said something foolish. Like I wish someone I love thought so too. When Ethan finally called, it was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. The sun was spilling across the floor in a warm stripe. I almost didn't answer, but old habits die hard. "Hi, Mom," he said, in the voice he uses when something is about to be asked or explained away. I wanted to check in. I waited. She's really protective right now. About the baby. About everything. He paused. I stayed silent. She thinks maybe it's better for now if we all just sort of take some space. I asked. From me? He said. Just until we find our rhythm. It's been hard. I said. I understand. And I did. Not the logic, but the pattern. The shape of being asked to disappear with a kind smile and careful syntax. He didn't mean to hurt me. He just didn't mean not to. After that call, I went into the hall closet and pulled out the gift box with the photo album I had started. It was mostly blank. Just a few entries. A photo of the ultrasound, a note I'd written the night the money transferred, a picture of the blanket folded on my lap. I tore out the page with the ultrasound. I burned it in the sink, one edge at a time, holding it with metal tongs like evidence of something that had once been promised. The ashes crumbled like tea leaves. I didn't cry. I just ran the tap until the water carried it all away. A few days later, I ran into a friend at the library, someone I hadn't seen since the days when Ethan was in Little League, and we used to share thermoses on cold bleachers. She asked about the baby. I smiled and said, "She's healthy." "They're doing well," she said. "I bet you're the best, Grandma. That baby must be so spoiled." I just nodded. I wanted to say something honest, something that would explain the strange loneliness of being a grandmother in name only. But I didn't. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Or maybe it was everyone's. I borrowed a book about birds, one I'd already read before. When I got home, I placed it on the table next to the knitting needles and sat down to open it. A sparrow landed on the windowsill as I flipped the first page. It stayed for a moment, then flew away. I stayed sitting long after it was gone. The next morning, I wrote a card and left it blank inside. I placed it in an envelope and addressed it to the baby. Just her name. No stamp. No return address. I didn't send it. I placed it in a drawer with the others. Cards I'd written for birthdays that would pass without my presence. Holidays I wouldn't be invited to. Milestones I would witness only through second-hand anecdotes. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't protesting. I was preserving. Not memories, but my own presence. My own refusal to become a ghost. My knitting resumed. But now it was for strangers. I volunteered at the shelter once a week, folding donated clothes, smiling at women whose eyes had seen more dismissal than mine, and still knew how to laugh. One of them, a young woman named Shanice, asked me if I had grandkids. I hesitated, then said, "Yes." She smiled and said, "Then you must be rich in stories." I nodded. I didn't say the stories had mostly stopped being told. I didn't say they had erased me. I just kept folding. That evening I received a group email from Lisa, a photo gallery of the baby's first professional shoot. 10 photos in total, all sepia-toned, all perfect. Ruffled dresses, floral headbands, Lisa holding the baby in a sunlit field, her mother beside her. Caption: 3 generations of strength. My chest tightened. I stared at the screen for a long time before clicking delete. No reply, no acknowledgement, no fire, just ash. The shift did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came like an ache that had been there all along. only now I had grown still enough to feel it. One morning I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Ethan used to do his homework with one foot curled under him and a pencil clenched too tight in his fist. And I looked around and realized I hadn't heard his voice in 3 weeks. Not a text, not a call, not even a forwarded meme, the kind he used to send without context, but with a little emoji that meant he was thinking of me, or at least that I still lived somewhere in the back of his mind. I stood up, poured the same cup of tea I had poured every morning, and drank it without sugar. I had run out days ago and never wrote it down on the list. That was when I understood something. I had stopped preparing for their return. I had stopped thinking, maybe this week they'll call, or maybe next month they'll ask me to visit. I had stopped expecting the door to open, and with that came a strange kind of quiet not filled with loss, but with possibility. That afternoon, I pulled the blanket from the top of the wardrobe. Not the one I had sent, not the one that disappeared into the silence of their household, but another. One I had started without purpose. It was all blues and grays and soft creams, a patchwork of winter light. I hadn't known who I was making it for. Maybe for a donation, maybe for no one. But when I laid it across the couch, I realized it wasn't a gift. It was furniture now, part of my home. I began knitting not with names in mind, but moods, memories, weather. A mustard yellow square for the sun I missed, a slate gray one for my husband's favorite cardigan, a soft lilac for my mother's hands. It became a map of self, something stitched not for approval, but for understanding. And when it was done, I didn't wrap it. I used it. I pulled it over my legs when I read, when I sat at the window, when I let the evening slip over the edges of the day like a closing book. That same week, a girl from the library knitting circle approached me after the session. She had watched me for weeks without speaking, always sitting 2 chairs away, knitting fast but unevenly, her yarn a tangle of hopeful mistakes. Her name was Andrea. She asked if I could show her how to keep her edges straight. I said yes. We met on Tuesdays, just for an hour at first. She was 27, single, quiet, and wore clothes that didn't quite match, like she got dressed from memory. One day, she brought me a small bag of tea and said, "You remind me of my grandmother. She died before I learned how to do anything useful." I told her that usefulness wasn't inherited. It was chosen. She laughed. A real one, the kind that makes you blink. For the first time in weeks, I laughed too. It was Andrea who first said the word healing. We were talking about yarn weights, and she mentioned how she'd taken up knitting after a breakup. "I thought it would help me stitch something back together," she said. Then added, "I didn't realize it'd be me." The sentence sat between us like a candle. I looked down at my hands, so practiced, so aged, and said, "That's what it does. It keeps your hands moving until your heart catches up." I hadn't meant to say it. It was just there, waiting. The next morning, I walked to the post office and bought a single stamp. I didn't have a letter in my hand. Not yet. But the act of buying the stamp felt like the first step in something. I tucked it into my wallet and left. At the corner cafe, the girl behind the counter asked if I wanted my usual. I didn't have a usual, but apparently I did now. She handed me a coffee just how I liked it, and said, "It's nice to see you every Thursday." I said, "It's nice to be seen." She smiled. I sat by the window and let the coffee go lukewarm, while I watched the world move around me. No one asked me to be anywhere. No one expected me to perform a role. And for the first time, I didn't feel punished by that. I felt released. That weekend, I cleaned out the top drawer of my dresser. I found the receipts from the IVF transfer, the printed confirmation from the bank, the envelope I had once labeled "For the baby's future." I unfolded the document and stared at the numbers. The math was clear. The outcome was not. I slipped it back into the envelope, crossed out the label, and wrote a new one in steady letters. For closure. I placed it in the back of the drawer and covered it with a scarf. Not to hide it, just to soften its presence. I spent more time at the shelter. Not because I was needed, but because I wanted to be somewhere where my hands mattered. Shanice brought in her daughter one day, a baby with bright eyes and the kind of hair that refused to be tamed. She handed me the girl and said, "Here, hold her while I find her shoes." I held that child like I'd been holding babies all my life. She reached for the buttons on my cardigan and cooed. Shanice laughed. "She likes you." I said, "I like her too." I didn't ask her name. It didn't matter. That baby didn't know what I had lost. She only knew my lap was warm and my voice was soft. And for 10 minutes, that was enough. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket over my knees and thought about the word grandmother. How it can be a title or a tether. How it can be given and taken, spoken and revoked. I decided then that I would stop waiting for someone to hand me the right to use it. I would stop waiting, period. The next day, I wrote a list. Not of groceries or tasks or birthdays I would no longer be invited to, but of things I still wanted to try. Take a bus to the next town, dye a skein of wool myself, eat in a restaurant alone and not pretend I was waiting for someone. I pinned the list to the fridge and crossed off, "Write the list." Small victories, but mine. That Sunday I walked to the farmer's market and bought a bouquet of imperfect flowers. The vendor apologized for the bruised petals. I said, "They're just experienced." He laughed and gave me a discount. I took them home and put them in a chipped vase. They lasted 5 days. On the 6th, I pressed one into a book and threw the rest away. Not everything has to last forever to be worth having. And so, by inches, my life began to take shape around its absences. I no longer checked my phone first thing. I no longer waited for their voices. The hole they left remained, but I stopped trying to fill it with old expectations. I let it be a space, a silence that belonged to me, a silence in which something else might grow. It was the envelope that did it, not the silence, not the erasure, not even the photo of the baby wearing another woman's bracelet on her tiny wrist, in one of those filtered portraits posted online with the caption, "Generations of Grace." It was the envelope, fat and cream-colored, that arrived in my mailbox on a Wednesday afternoon, just after I had finished trimming the lavender that grows haphazardly by the front steps. My hands still smelled faintly of crushed green, and I carried the mail inside without thinking. Bills, coupons, something from the pharmacy, and then this. Thick paper, elegant font, no return address. But I recognized Ethan's handwriting, even as he tried to disguise it with the careful spacing people use when they think they're being professional. I opened it at the counter, standing, not because I was in a rush, but because I didn't want to give it the formality of sitting down. Inside were 6 typed pages, single-spaced, with no salutation. No, "Dear Mom." No, "Hi." Just a block of text that began mid-accusation. "I can't believe you did this." That was the first line. No context, no build-up, as if my decision to stop calling, to stop texting, to stop offering myself up like a service provider whose subscription had quietly expired, was an act of war. He wrote about Lisa crying every night, about how confused the baby would be growing up not knowing her grandmother, about how abandoning the family during such a critical time was unthinkably selfish. There was no mention of the money, no mention of the blanket, or the meals, or the polite silence I had worn like a second skin for months. There was no mention of the IVF, or the car rides, or the clinic chairs I sat in while they counted follicles in the back room. Just this rewriting of the story, where I was now the absent one, the unstable variable, the problem. "We're willing to talk," he concluded, "but only if you're ready to be reasonable." I folded the letter and set it down beside the kettle. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even boil the water. I just stood there, absorbing the fact that the son I had lifted from fevered beds and carried through funerals and fed on nights when I could barely stand myself, now saw my boundaries as betrayal. That was when I understood. They wanted a witness, not a woman. 2 days later, Lisa appeared at the cafe. I was on my second shift of the week, and the morning rush had just started to thin. The bell above the door jingled, and I looked up instinctively. She was standing near the pastry display, pretending to study the chalkboard, her coat too stiff and clean for a place that smelled like burnt toast and fryer oil. I didn't say anything. I kept wiping the counter. She hesitated, then stepped forward. "Martha," she said, her voice quiet. I raised my eyebrows. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded toward the booth near the back. She sat down like a woman walking onto ice, carefully, afraid of slipping. I sat across from her and said nothing. She started, with the usual. "We've been concerned. Ethan misses you. The baby should know her grandmother. We didn't mean for things to get so distant." I let her talk. Then I said, "You erased me." She flinched, but only slightly. "That was never our intention." I leaned forward just a little. "You left me out of every photo, every event, every moment. I paid for her beginning, and you wrote me out of the credits." She looked down at her hands, her nails perfectly manicured, a pale neutral color that matched the safe ambiguity of her tone. "We were overwhelmed," she said. "We needed space." I nodded. "And now, you need control." She opened her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "Kieran wrote you a letter. He asked me to deliver it. He misses you." That stopped me. I took the envelope without opening it, set it beside the sugar caddy, and said, "He knows how to find me. He doesn't need a messenger." She looked smaller then, deflated, the corners of her ambition collapsing inward. "I didn't want to replace you," she said quietly. "I just didn't want your presence in every room." I looked at her a long moment. That, at least, was honest. "Well," I said, "you got your wish." She left without finishing her coffee. I watched her go, then picked up the envelope and held it in my palm for a long time. It felt warm, like it had been pressed close to something living. Later, in the quiet of my kitchen, I opened it. Kieran's handwriting was jagged, rushed, still boyish despite being almost 20. "I remember," he wrote. "I always remembered." That was all, but it was enough to bring something soft back to the surface. I pressed the letter flat, placed it in the drawer with my scarf, and didn't reply. Not yet. The next week, Ethan sent a man in a suit, a lawyer. He waited outside the cafe, then came in after my shift and asked, "Are you Mrs. Martha Harlow?" I said I was. He said, "I represent your son and daughter-in-law. They're concerned about your well-being and your assets." I blinked. "My well-being is excellent," I said, "and my assets are mine." He shifted awkwardly. "They'd like to ensure you're in a safe environment. Perhaps discuss next steps?" I folded my apron, laid it on the counter, and said, "Tell them I'm not a pet they forgot to pick up. There are no next steps unless I take them." I left him there, blinking in the light like someone emerging from a tunnel. That evening I wrote a letter, not to Ethan, not to Lisa, but to their lawyer. It was brief. "There is no cause for legal concern. I am of sound mind, residing safely and not under duress. Any future attempts to question my agency will be considered harassment." I mailed it the next morning with a stamp that had a goldfinch on it. I chose that on purpose. Goldfinches sing even in winter. After that, there were no more visits, no more calls. Not even from Kieran, though I imagined he was still watching. I didn't mind. I had work to do. I started a new blanket, this one not for a baby, but for my own lap. Deep navy and rust red, like the colors of my wedding bouquet. I joined a trivia team at the community center. I volunteered to teach basic knitting to teenagers in juvenile detention. I was asked to speak at a small group for women over 70 called Still Here. I told them my story, not for sympathy, but because silence had been mistaken for absence too many times. I said, the story they wrote me out of wasn't mine to begin with. They clapped. Some cried. One woman stayed after and hugged me so tightly I could feel her whole history in her arms. Then came the newspaper article. A neighbor brought it to the cafe. Missing matriarch. Family speaks out. A photo of me from 5 years ago, holding a pie dish at some barbecue. Quotes from Ethan and Lisa. We just want her safe. She vanished without a word. We're heartbroken, Lisa added. She's vulnerable. We fear something happened. I laughed so hard I scared a customer. Vulnerable. That's the word they use for people they want to control. That night, I clipped the article and pinned it to the back of my kitchen cabinet, just behind the measuring cups. Not as a keepsake, as evidence. One Thursday, I returned home to find another envelope on my porch. This time it was handwritten, stamped locally. Inside, a single sheet of notebook paper. Grandma, I'm coming to Portland. I want to see you. I'm not bringing anyone. I just want to talk. Room 12, Red Fern Motel. Friday and Saturday. If not, I'll understand. Kieran. I stood with the letter in my hand for a long time, then went inside and made tea. I didn't answer right away. I didn't owe anyone that. But Friday morning came and I dressed with care. Not for him, for me. Navy coat, cherry lipstick, the necklace I hadn't worn since Derek's funeral. I walked to the motel. I knocked once. He opened the door like he'd been waiting with his hand already on the knob. His eyes were wide, unsure. "Hi, Grandma," he said. I stepped in and nodded. "Hi, sweetheart." We didn't talk much at first. The room smelled like hotel soap and French fries. He offered me the desk chair and sat on the bed. There were books everywhere, half-read paperbacks with dog-eared pages. He said, "I read your letter." I said, "I didn't send it." "I know," he said, "but Mom found it. I'm glad you wrote it anyway." We talked for hours, about nothing, about everything. He told me he had a job at a bookstore, that he wrote poetry sometimes, that he still remembered how my kitchen smelled in winter. He didn't ask me to come back. I didn't ask him to stay. But before I left, he handed me a book wrapped in brown paper. Poems I underlined. The ones that made me think of you. That night, I read them slowly by lamplight. One line stayed with me. There are women who rise not from fire, but from forgetting who told them they couldn't. I taped it inside my closet door. And so I rose, not dramatically, not triumphantly, just quietly, steadily, in my own time, on my own terms. The moment I decided to change my will, it was not dramatic. There was no final straw, no sudden revelation. It came, instead, on a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon, as I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom and caught sight of myself, not in motion, not distracted, but still. I was wearing a cardigan I had knitted months earlier, the pale lavender one with the wide-ribbed sleeves, and for a moment I looked like someone else's grandmother, someone loved, cherished, framed on a mantel. But then I looked closer and saw the expression on my face, the one that had taken shape slowly over the last year. It was not bitterness. It was not regret. It was a recognition of absence, an acknowledgement of all the space I had quietly made inside myself, where other people used to live. And it was then, in that stillness, that I knew. The story they wrote for me was over, but mine was not. I called the attorney my neighbor had recommended, a woman named Jean with a gravelly voice and a calm, precise way of speaking that made me feel like I was finally standing on solid ground. We met in her office, a small room with dusty blinds and a framed quote on the wall that read, "Tell the truth and trust yourself." I handed her the previous copy of my will, the one I had drawn up 5 years earlier, in which everything, savings, property, insurance, was allocated to Ethan and, in the event of his death, to the grandchild who had now grown beyond my reach. Jean read through it in silence, then looked up. "Do you want to exclude them?" she asked, not unkindly. I nodded. "I want to leave what I have to someone who will feel its weight." She didn't blink. "Who would that be?" she asked. I pulled from my bag a pamphlet I had kept folded in my wallet for months. It was from a fund that provided legal and financial support for grandmothers, raising grandchildren whose parents were absent, addicted, or incarcerated. "Them," I said. "The ones who are doing everything with nothing. She nodded and made a note. We went over the details, account balances, property, personal items. When she asked if I wanted to include a letter, I said yes. I didn't write it that day. I went home, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with my pen in hand, and the house completely quiet. I wrote slowly, carefully, as if the paper might bruise under the weight of what I had to say. I wrote about love, given without return. I wrote about being written out of a story I paid to begin. I wrote about silence, and how heavy it can become when it piles up in the corners of your life like dust. And then I wrote something I hadn't known until that very moment. I am not giving this because I want to punish. I am giving this because I want my life to matter somewhere. Not as a footnote, not as a donor, but as a person who knew how to make something warm with her hands, and finally decided to wrap it around herself. The next morning, I signed the new documents in Jean's office. She handed me the copy and said, "If there's anything else?" I shook my head. There isn't. This is the last thing I owed myself. I walked out into the spring air, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. On the way home, I stopped at the post office. I brought with me a padded envelope, already sealed. Inside it was a copy of the IVF receipt, the original check receipt from the bank, and a letter I had rewritten more times than I could count. It was not angry. It was not even sad. It simply stated the facts. I funded the beginning of her life, but I was denied a place in it. This is not a request for recognition. It is a record of what was, what I gave, what was taken, what I now release. I addressed it to Ethan and Lisa's house, not because I expected them to open it, but because I needed to send it. The act mattered. The delivery was the closure. I handed it to the clerk, paid for tracking, and walked out without looking back. When I got home, I took the baby pictures I had secretly printed from the internet, photos where I had never been invited, moments I had not witnessed, and I placed them in an envelope. I wrote on the outside, "Not mine," and I put it in the trash. It was not an act of cruelty. It was a burial. I was laying to rest a version of the future that had never truly been offered to me. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I was no longer mourning what hadn't happened. I was making room for what could. That evening, I sat down with my knitting basket and pulled out a pattern I had once started and abandoned. It was intricate, complex, an heirloom shawl with twisted stitches and lacework that required attention and patience. I cast on the first row and let my fingers find their rhythm. The yarn slipped through my hands like memory, like breath. I wasn't making it for anyone, not to give, not to be seen. I was making it to mark the moment I had chosen myself. 3 days later, a message arrived. An email from Ethan. I stared at the subject line. "We received your letter," and debated whether to open it. I did. It was short, just a few lines. "I don't understand what you're trying to prove. This feels unnecessary and hurtful. We always appreciated what you did, even if we didn't say it often. We thought you were giving from love, not for leverage. I'm sorry you feel excluded, but this approach won't fix anything. We'll respect your decision. We just hoped for better." I read it once, then again. I closed the laptop. I didn't reply. There was nothing to defend, nothing to explain. They had built a version of the story where I was either selfless or selfish, invisible or too demanding. I no longer accepted those terms. That night, I lit a candle on the porch, the big citronella one I usually reserve for summer. I watched the flame flicker, steady and alone, and thought about how long I had waited for someone to hand me a title. Mother, grandmother, family, loved, and how quietly those titles had been withheld or revoked. I thought about how many women I'd met in recent months who carried the same weight, erased, reframed, sidelined not with violence, but with polite neglect. And I thought about how powerful it was to stop waiting, to decide that your story was still your own, even if no one else was reading it anymore. In the days that followed, I felt a calm settle over me. Not peace, that would take more time, but steadiness. I kept knitting. I read more poetry. I hosted a tea afternoon for the women from the Still Here group, and served lemon cake with candied ginger. One of them brought her granddaughter, a girl with a wide, curious gaze, who asked if I had any stories. Thousands, I said. Some of them even true. She laughed. I told her one about a girl who learned to listen to silence and found her way through it like a forest. When they left, the girl hugged me without being told to. I held her for a moment and whispered, "Don't let anyone decide your worth." She nodded. Maybe she understood. Maybe not. It didn't matter. The saying of it mattered. That weekend, I returned to the Red Fern Motel. Kieran was staying again, passing through before heading west. He brought me a new book of poems. We sat outside on the bench and ate French fries from a paper bag. He said, "They think you hate them." I said, "They don't know the difference between boundaries and punishment." He nodded. "I do." Then he said, "You're the only adult who ever told me the truth without using it like a knife." I looked at him and saw Ethan's eyes, but softer, unsure, not yet shaped by the same angles of control. "You can visit me any time," I said. "Not because you're my grandson, because you're kind." He smiled, and I thought, for the first time in months, that maybe not everything had been wasted. When he left, he gave me a photo he had taken on his phone. It was of the shawl I'd been knitting, laid out in the afternoon light, each stitch clear and deliberate. He said, "This is how I see you." I thanked him. I put the photo on the fridge. No frames, no captions. Just the quiet beauty of something made with care. And with that, the chapter closed. Not with slamming doors or dramatic gestures, but with the subtle, irreversible act of choosing dignity over longing. The mornings are quieter now, not because they were ever loud, but because something has shifted in the silence. It no longer echoes with absence. It hums with intention. I wake with the light, not with expectation. I make my tea, strong and plain, and I sit by the window, not to wait for something or someone, but to observe what already is. There's a sparrow that visits the same branch every morning, just outside the glass. I watch her hop, pause, flutter. I do not name her. I do not need to. It is enough that we both return to the same spot, steady and unspoken, as if to say, we are still here. I've stopped counting the months since I last saw the baby. that measure no longer holds value. She is growing somewhere, being taught words and routines and preferences by people who do not speak of me. I know this without being told. I've stopped hoping for a photo, a thank you, a shift in weather. Hope is a quiet hunger when it goes unanswered too long. So I've learned to replace it with something else. Action without attachment. I knit for the shelter, for the hospital, for the fire station downtown that takes blankets for displaced families. I don't ask who receives them. I only ask that they be used, warmed, held. Once a week I meet with the girls at the community center. They are loud, distracted, always on their phones. But when I show them how to cast on, they fall into an almost sacred silence, watching their own hands with awe, like they didn't know they were capable of creating anything soft. One of them, Brielle, said to me last week, "You're not like other old ladies." I asked her what that meant. She said, "You don't try to make us small. You just help us make something." I wrote that down in my notebook that night. Not because it was profound, but because it reminded me of how long I had been trying to make myself smaller, more acceptable, easier to love. No more. These days, I stretch, I occupy, I exist. I still think of Ethan. Not with bitterness, with a sort of distant tenderness, like the way you think of a favorite shirt you lost in a move. Remembering how it fit, how it felt, knowing you'll never wear it again. I think of the boy he was, not the man he's become. And I've come to understand something I wish I'd known earlier. Being a mother does not require erasing yourself. It does not require you to vanish so that someone else can shine. That kind of love is not noble. It's dangerous. It breeds ghosts. I was nearly one of them, but not any more. I've given up writing letters that won't be read. I've given up sending gifts that will be returned or ignored. But I haven't given up love. I've simply redirected it to the girl at the shelter who sobbed when I gave her a blanket that reminded her of her grandmother, to the boy who came to his first knitting lesson, hiding bruises and left with a scarf he made himself, to the woman at the cafe who sits alone every Tuesday morning, and now lets me join her because, as she says, 2 silences are better than 1. Love doesn't need the name family to be real. It needs presence, care, willingness. I still keep the shawl Kieran photographed. It hangs on the back of my reading chair. Sometimes I wrap it around my shoulders, not because I'm cold, but because I want to feel the weight of something I made just for myself. I think of him sometimes too. Kieran, of the young man who looked me in the eye and asked nothing but to be seen. Maybe he will return one day. Maybe not. I have no expectations. That is my freedom now. I live without waiting. I breathe without asking. The house is the same. The light still falls across the kitchen floor in wide gold stripes. The photos on the wall remain, but I've removed the ones that felt dishonest. Those curated smiles, those stiff holidays, in their place. I've hung landscapes, pressed flowers, handwritten poems from girls who found their way back to themselves by following thread and wool. My refrigerator is no longer a gallery of someone else's life. It's covered in grocery lists, reminders to water the basil, and that photo Kieran gave me. The shawl in afternoon light, every stitch visible. Sometimes I imagine what I would say to her, my granddaughter, If ever she stood before me, curious, uncertain, half-formed by other people's stories, I wouldn't try to explain. I wouldn't try to correct. I would simply say, I loved you before you had a name. I made things for you with my own 2 hands. That love never left, even when I did. And then I would show her how to knit. Not because I expect her to care, but because making something with your hands teaches you about patience, mistakes, and the quiet power of persistence. There is no reunion coming, no apology, no invitation. But there is peace, and there is clarity. I did what I could. I gave what I had, and when that was not enough for them, I chose not to become less. That is the victory no one can take from me. That is the inheritance I now pass on, to girls who thought they had to wait to be loved, to women who thought they had to disappear to stay close, to anyone who has ever whispered, I'm still here, into a room that did not answer back. I whisper it still. Not for them. For me. I'm still here. And I always will be.